Thank you, Mr. Secretary. My name is Peter Buttigieg. I'm a first year here at Harvard College. Despite all the people they kill in the third world, cholera and tuberculosis are not the subject of major vaccine research by American pharmaceuticals. However, in the near future, there will be the release of a drug to treat separation anxiety for dogs. My question is, what steps can be taken, or concrete steps are being taken in American economic policy to ensure that even when we run up against the limits of the power of markets, that today's prosperity in the new economy means a tangible, qualitative human improvement worldwide and not just good business at home?
I'm glad you asked that question. We are working we have included in the President's budget, and we will be working in the next several weeks before Congress goes out of sessions to pass the President's vaccine tax credit. The President's vaccine tax credit is actually based on ideas that in many respects were developed here at Harvard. It starts from the premise that the reason for the anomalies you described in research are that market incentives are shaped by those who can pay and those who cannot pay. And therefore, the central element in the credit program is the creation of a purchase fund for vaccines that would only be used in the case of a successful development of a vaccine for cholera or tuberculosis or one of two or three other diseases that would match any payments made by aid agencies or foundations so as to create a larger market and therefore to motivate research. And for a variety of reasons, we believe that establishing the market in that way is probably likely to produce a stronger and more focused effort than simply strategies that subsidize research. And the question now is whether the Congress will respond to the President's call to support that measure. And that's why I very much welcome the interest of concerned citizens on this issue like yourself, and I hope as many as possible will make their concerns known.
Thank you. Thank you. My name is Peter Buttigieg. I'm a freshman here at the college. I have a sort of historical question for Mr. Sorensen. There's this great scene toward the end of the movie where you're in the bathroom with Kenny O'Donnell shaving, and you've been asked to write two speeches, one which is actually used and one in the event that there are airstrikes. And you're explaining that you can't even imagine how you would have explained airstrikes. I realize that's probably quite a dramatization, but I wonder, as someone who studies both history and politics, if you dared to prepare a way to explain airstrikes and how you would have gone about doing that.
Well, that's a very interesting question. The movie actually oversimplifies what actually happened. And it is true that I, having originally been instructed to write two speeches, one for each of the two major courses we were considering, only wrote one. But it's really a drafting job within a drafting job because of the need for notice before we bombed. The instructions were, come up with a letter to Khrushchev to be delivered by a personal emissary from the President that will prevent him from immediately reacting, pressing some button or signaling that the missiles be aimed at us, that will make it impossible for him to avoid or evade giving a prompt answer, that will assure that the answer is one that he will withdraw the missiles or else, and that is not in any way an ultimatum that the world and history would condemn us for. And I did go back to my office, and I failed to write that.
Hi, my name's Peter Buttigieg. I'm a first-year student at the college here. It's my understanding from generations older than mine that most of the people in them who went into public service did so out of inspiration for a grand figure who was usually the American president. As we've discussed, it seems that the presidency has now evolved into what's called the MBA White House, or the corporate model. I mean, among presidents, comparative obscurity. I guess my question is, somebody who loves being here in the shadow of President Kennedy, and who, if I weren't here right now, would be at home watching my favorite show, The West Wing. What's happened to the image of the American presidency? And just because we know more about the men who are president, is that magic really gone forever?
Let me ask David Gergen to respond to that.
Peter, that's a really good question. The magic has certainly been diminished. The office has been tarnished over the years. I don't think you can lay this, by the way, just at George W. Bush's door. I don't think that's fair to him. There have been several of his predecessors who have been hardly inspirations and have hardly appealed to the idealism of youth. I think it's a worthy challenge of this president to see if he can stir you and others, knowing that it may be hard for him on a Harvard campus, but there are other places in the country where, other universities where fine students go, where who might really get stirred. I do think this is one of the biggest questions facing your generation, because you've got a very idealistic generation. Your generation, in my judgment, is much more spiritual than some of the people a little older. I think that you all, by and large, are much better educated. But as far as I can tell, many people in your generation are rejecting politics and rejecting government as an instrument for change. You go into nonprofits, you do a lot of other things. Here at the Kennedy School, only half our graduates go into government. This Kennedy School of Government. This is, many go over to McKinsey or other things like that. And it's a question of pay, and partly is, but it's also a question of the nobility of the service and a sense of what one gets out of that. And I think one of the big challenges of the older generation now, recognizing that one half the people in the civil service today are going to be eligible for retirement within 5 years. 65% of the senior executive service is going to be eligible for early retirement within 5 years. Plus, you've got this busted, broken down system of appointments, so that it's hard to get people to put themselves into this process. One of the real challenges now is to make an appeal to you that both reaches towards your idealism, but also gives you a place where you can go and be inspired by what you're doing. Many of you don't want to do this because you think it's a bureaucracy down, if you go into Washington or state government or whatever. And corporations have found ways now to empower people, to push power down in, to push leadership down to the organizations, to make it very adaptable, very fluid, and we have to be looking at ways to do that. That's one of the reasons I think we should be excited about the Innovations Program coming here to the Kennedy School, because it's going to introduce that spirit of innovation much more deeply into the Kennedy School and into Harvard, and that really has to come to government. I don't care whether it's a Republican administration or Democratic administration, but we have to create a sense, again, for your generation that public service is a noble calling.
Thank you. My name is Peter. I'm a second-year student at the college. I always grew up feeling that there was an asymmetry between the impact of American affairs abroad and the impact of the rest of the world on us, so that any decision made in Washington would have the most profound impact in the most remote street, but no decision made outside of our borders, even, I'm afraid to say, in Canada, would really affect the average American in a way that we would feel. And it seems like this asymmetry, if not being corrected, changed on Tuesday, because some chain of events, which had a lot to do with the state of affairs abroad, literally plunged our streets into, at least in lower Manhattan, plunged the street into chaos. So are we likely to see now, for the average American, a greater respect for international institutions, a better sensitivity for international affairs, and understanding of the way everything is connected? Or can we expect to go international just long enough for our international war effort, and then just pull right back into where the U.S. is what we worry about and the rest of the world is just that?
David, as a man who had to represent the people, how would you answer that?
Peter, I think this event has brought our attention to the fact that we are a pretty small world, and that we as a country cannot isolate ourselves from events, nor can we try to get other countries to isolate themselves from the rest of the world. I think that we're a part of the world community, and we've got to even play a greater role. And oddly enough, there's been a feeling lately that we were trying to separate ourselves from the rest of the world and kind of go it alone. But right now, I think that this has been such a cataclysmic event that it has once again reminded us that we've got to have friends, and we've got to have partners, and we've got to have allies. And I think that we will I think we've learned a great lesson. This is an expensive way to do it, but I think we've learned a real lesson in these last 7 days. Thank you, though.
Let me say in concluding also a comment on your question, which is there is a tremendous danger of America and Americans, because we are so large and wealthy, of becoming extremely parochial. And indeed, when I greet the new students at the Kennedy School, I point out that we're proud at the Kennedy School that 44% of our students are from overseas. We're the most international school at Harvard, because we regard the students from overseas not only as guests who are picking up an education here, but as teachers who are teaching Americans about what the rest of the world is like. And I advise the Kennedy School students, and I would advise you in Harvard College, where only 6% of the students are non-Canadian foreigners, 9% if you include the Canadians, make an effort to meet somebody from a different country, because that will, and become friends with them, because that will be as important a contribution to your education here at Harvard as any of the courses that you will take. And I think that's something for us to remember as we conclude, which is that we really do have to broaden our perspectives and to think about the world in which we're living. Cliche is that globalization is with us, and the answer is yes, it is. And that means that as we think of solutions, as we try to repair the damage and think of ways to approach the answers in the future, we do want to make sure we think of it from broader perspectives than we've been used to in the last decade or so. In some ways, the end of the Cold War made life too easy for us. The Soviet Union went away, and if you look at what happened, according to public opinion polls, to American attitudes, we didn't turn isolationist, we turned indifferent to the rest of the world. We spent less time reading and watching foreign events. Our news magazines, our television shows have less content on what's going on in the rest of the world. And I think what David Pryor just said is we can't afford that any longer. So as we go back toward our classes, toward the various events that will preoccupy us in the weeks to come, let's remember that we do have to think about these events in a broader perspective. We hope that these forums or community discussions which we've had will help in that. But I think all of us, as we move forward, want to ask ourselves what we can do and how do we see this in a broader perspective. And again, today, as with the end of our first community discussion last week, I'd urge that we end it with a minute of silence for those who died a week ago today.
Thank you. My name is Peter. I'm a junior at the college from Indiana. When we look at the Cold War, we usually see it in global language or strategic or geopolitical language, and it seems as though political considerations are delightfully and totally absent from the thinking in the White House at the time, as though domestic politics was suspended during those 13 days. And I'm wondering if that impression is accurate, and if such a thing is possible today.
It certainly is accurate as far as 40 years ago. President Kennedy never considered the political gains or disadvantages from the crisis, made clear never to exploit it in any of his talks. He pretty much stopped political campaigning on his part, the vice president's part, and never let the rest of us make any kind of political reference to the crisis.
Let me comment on the word political. I'm not trying to be a Clinton with his, but it's important we understand what we mean by political. Ted has answered with respect to domestic politics. It had zero effect, in my opinion, on Kennedy's thinking, as Ted said. But the political relations with other nations, the U.S. security guarantees, Japan, Korea, whatever, to NATO, the context in which the crisis would end in the Soviet Union, they had tried to take West Berlin from us a few months before, well, a year or so before, in the fall of '61. We came, I called the SACEUR, General Norstad, to my office And I said, look, they've done this, we've done that. How's this going to evolve? He said, well, they'll do A, we'll do B, they'll do C. And I said, what do we do then? He said, well, we use nuclear weapons. Now, we were in a Cold War. And the political context of geopolitical relations had a tremendous bearing on the way the president reacted. He was determined to get those missiles out of there without weakening the security of the West and without war. And he did.
Thank you, Senator. My name is Peter. I'm a student at the college. Looking at the... Does he speak?
No, I'm not looking around.
Looking at the same question from the Democratic side, it feels like a lot of your colleagues have adopted a posture of being, for whatever the Republicans are for, only less. The tax cut's just a smaller one, and the war just maybe not quite as quick as the Republican war. And then there are voices like your own, which are more forceful in opposition. I wonder if you see this as a split in the Democratic Party, and how you think, politically speaking, in the next few years, your party's going to sort out what it thinks the meaning of opposition is.
Well, I would certainly expect that those differences would be clearer I think they are getting clearer as time goes on. Certainly with regards to the involvement in on Iraq, and I think that they would get clearer as the time goes on. It's interesting when you said not as much. I would have said that sort of about the Republicans in the 60s to the 80s. We passed civil rights; they'd be for civil rights, but not as much. We'd be for education, but they'd be not as much. So it used to be they were trying to be like us, and now they win, and some Democrats are trying to be like them. But you know, the interesting thing is, and I didn't mention in this talk, but I did last week. We had a series of Democrats that voted with President Bush, and President Bush went out there and campaigned as hard against all those Democrats that voted with him as he possibly could in order to beat them. And he went out there and campaigned against those who voted against. He didn't defeat a single United States senator that voted against his tax program. The one that was the toughest on it was Tom Harkin, had the hardest race and won by the biggest majority on it. So hopefully people, our colleagues, will understand that it just doesn't make any sense. If they're going to go out and do everything they can to beat you, and the idea that you're sort of going along with them isn't going to make any difference. This last election ought to prove it to them. I think some have gotten the message, but it shouldn't have to be that way.
This is what we've all been waiting for on our program right now. This is not the first time that you've been on Hardball in a live event. In fact, many years ago, you asked a question of a presidential candidate who visited your college, Harvard. Here you were back in 2003 asking Dick Gephardt about young voters.
Congressman, why are you the only presidential candidate not attending tomorrow's youth-oriented Rock the Vote Forum? And do you think young people's votes matter in your campaign?
They matter a lot. That's why I'm here tonight. And I've got to be in Iowa. I had a preset meeting that I've got to go to. I got to win Iowa. I'm going to win Iowa, so I'm going to be in Iowa tomorrow night. But I talk to young people everywhere I am. I've got lots of young people on my campaign, and maybe I ought to say this now. When I was in college, Jack Kennedy was president. And I was moved when he said to young people like me, get involved in politics. Give part of your life to politics. So I just want to say to all of you here, get involved in public life. Give back to your country. Don't just take from it. And get involved in this campaign. If it's not for me, get behind somebody and get out there and work and make this country a better place. You can do this.
You haven't aged a year. Look at this guy. So was that the stimulation that you needed to make a move for public life?
First of all, I'm a lot more sympathetic to scheduling requests. Pretty hard on him. So I feel bad about that now.